Family dinners used to be sacred. At least that's what I thought. They were supposed to be about togetherness, about clinking glasses, sharing food, and catching up on the little things that made life feel connected. But somewhere along the way, they stopped being about family. They became performances. Forced smiles, staged laughter, and an unspoken competition that drained the air out of the room. And the star of that performance? My daughter-in-law. Now, I'll be fair. When my son first introduced her, I welcomed her with open arms. I told myself she was strong-willed, maybe just a little sharp around the edges. I thought she'd soften over time, that once she realized I wasn't her enemy, she'd see we were on the same side. But instead of softening, she hardened. Every word from her lips seemed dipped in sarcasm, every smile edged with teeth. The worst part wasn't even her. It was my son, my boy, the one I raised, the one I sacrificed for. He just sat there, silent, watching it unfold as though he were a stranger at the table and not my flesh and blood. That silence hurt worse than her words. But nothing prepared me for the breaking point. One evening, the table was crowded with family and friends. Glasses clinked, jokes bounced across the table, laughter filled the air. I was beginning to think maybe, just maybe, it would be one of those rare nights where peace could be found. And then she struck. With that smirk I'll never forget, she leaned back and casually announced that she was raising my rent to $7,000. The table erupted. Laughter rolled across the room like thunder. Everyone assuming it was a joke. Everyone assuming I couldn't possibly afford it. My son didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. I sat there, calm, because while they laughed, I knew something they didn't. The building was mine. That silence, that betrayal, that cruel little performance at my expense was the exact moment something in me shifted. And I made a decision. I wasn't going to let it slide. If you're reading this, you probably know it takes hours, sometimes days, to put stories like this together. So before we dive deeper into how I turn the tables, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It's free for you, but it keeps me going when I pour so much energy into these stories. So, are you ready to see what happens when the quiet one at the table stops staying quiet? If you were in my shoes, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have spoken up right there? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious how you'd react. They say the people who can hurt you the most are the ones you love the deepest. I used to think that was just something people said after bad breakups or messy divorces. But the truth of that statement hit me like a freight train the moment I realized my son, the child I raised, the boy I held when he was sick, the young man I watched walk across the stage at his college graduation, had chosen silence over defending his own mother. Before I tell you how everything unraveled, I think you need to understand who I am, where I come from, and why this betrayal cut so deeply. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Working class family. My father was a machinist. My mother worked part-time at a diner. We didn't have much, but what we had, we made last. I learned early the value of hard work, the importance of saving, and the quiet pride that comes from building something of your own, even if it's small. When I was 18, I got a scholarship to Kent State University. Nothing glamorous, but for me, it was everything. I studied accounting, which might sound boring to some, but I loved the order of it. Numbers made sense when people didn't. Numbers didn't lie, didn't talk behind your back, didn't play favorites. By the time I graduated, I had offers to work at small firms, but I wanted more. So, I packed my bags and moved to New York City. It wasn't easy. I rented a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Queens, worked long hours at a mid-tier accounting firm, and slowly built a reputation for myself. Clients came to trust me. My bosses noticed my dedication. Over the years, I climbed the ladder, not fast, but steady. I wasn't flashy, but I was smart. I saved. I invested. Real estate, especially. I knew the value of property in a city that never slept. By the time I was in my late 40s, I had built a comfortable life. 2 brownstones under my name. A healthy retirement account. Stability. Independence was my badge of honor. I didn't want to be anyone's burden. I didn't need handouts. Everything I had, I earned. And then came my son. My son. I was 30 when I had him. Just one child. I poured everything I had into raising him. financially, emotionally, spiritually. His father and I divorced when he was young, so it was just the two of us for most of his childhood. I played both roles, mom and dad. I showed up for every school play, every soccer game, every late night fever. We were close. At least I thought we were. He used to tell me everything, his fears, his dreams, the girls he liked in high school, the professors he admired in college. He wasn't just my son. He was my confidant, my reason for pushing harder at work. I wanted him to have more than I did growing up. And for a long time, I thought I had succeeded. He got into NYU, studied business, graduated with honors. I couldn't have been prouder. When he got his first job at a tech company in Manhattan, I thought, this is it. He's set. He's going to have the life I worked so hard to give him. And then he met her. I still remember the first time he brought her home. We met at a little Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, not far from where I lived. She walked in tall and polished, with that air of confidence that instantly filled the room. She wasn't rude, not at first, but there was a sharpness to her tone. Like she was testing me, weighing me, measuring whether I was worth her respect. She worked in marketing, she told me. Big firm, high-profile clients. She spoke about her job like it was war, and she was the general, commanding, decisive, unstoppable. My son looked at her like she hung the moon. I wanted to be happy for him. I wanted to believe she'd be good for him. But that first dinner set the tone for everything that followed. Little digs, disguised as jokes. Comments about how old-fashioned I seemed, how quaint it was that I still cooked Sunday dinners instead of ordering in. I brushed it off. I told myself she was young, maybe insecure, and that in time she'd come around. But instead of coming around, she pushed further. It started small, correcting me when I told a story, as though my memory couldn't be trusted. Laughing a little too hard when I mispronounced the name of some trendy new restaurant. Suggesting, casually, that maybe I should downsize my life. After all, wasn't it exhausting for someone my age to manage so much property? At first, I swallowed it. For my son's sake. For the sake of family harmony. But over time, those tiny paper cuts added up. A few years ago, after my arthritis started getting worse, my son suggested I move in with them. It'll be easier for you, Mom, he said. We've got space. You won't have to worry about climbing stairs. I resisted. I had my own apartment, my own routines, my independence. But he pushed. He promised it was temporary, that it would help him sleep better at night knowing I wasn't alone. Against my instincts, I agreed. That's when everything shifted. My daughter-in-law tolerated me at best. She made subtle comments about how much electricity I used, how long I spent in the shower, how many groceries I bought. I paid them rent, generously might I add, but she still acted as though I were freeloading. The whispers started soon after. Little hints dropped in conversations with family friends. It must be tough, having your mother-in-law around all the time. Or, I don't know how we're going to keep this up financially with another adult in the house. I heard them. I always heard them. And each time my son stayed silent. The silent witness. That silence was worse than her words. Because when someone you love refuses to stand up for you, it makes you question everything. Did I raise him wrong? Did all those years of sacrifice mean nothing? Was I so blind to who he really was? I tried to tell myself he was caught in the middle, that he didn't want to choose sides. But the truth? His silence was a choice, and he didn't choose me. That brings us back to that dinner. That awful, humiliating dinner where she announced she was raising my rent to $7,000. The laughter, the smirks, the eyes all turning toward me, expecting me to crumble. But I didn't, because while they laughed, I knew the truth. The very roof over their heads, the deed had my name on it. They could raise rent to $7,000 or $70,000, but in the end, it was me who had the final say. And that knowledge planted the seed of something I had never truly considered before: revenge. When you think about family betrayal, what's worse, the cutting words or the silence of someone you thought loved you? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts. Because for me, that night was only the beginning. And what came next? That was when I stopped being silent. You'd think after living as long as I have, there wouldn't be many moments left that could surprise me. I've seen love bloom and die. I've built a career from nothing and weathered recessions. I've buried friends, said goodbye to my parents, and even survived the lonely silence that follows divorce. Life teaches you that pain is inevitable, but it also teaches you to carry yourself with dignity through it. But nothing in all my years prepared me for that night. The night of the smirk. It was a Saturday evening in early spring. The kind of night where the city felt alive with promise. We lived in a brownstone in Brooklyn, one of the ones I had bought back in the 90s when prices were still within reach for ordinary people. To anyone looking in from the outside, it was the picture of success. Warm lights spilling out from the dining room windows, the smell of roasted chicken and garlic bread drifting into the street, laughter floating into the night. Inside, the long oak dining table was set for 10. My son and his wife had invited friends over, along with a few family members. I had cooked half the meal as usual, because despite her constant remarks about how unnecessary my old-fashioned dinners were, everyone devoured my food before hers. Cooking was my way of contributing, of making sure I wasn't seen as a burden. I wore my favorite navy blue dress that night. Simple, modest, but with just enough shape to remind myself, and them, that I wasn't invisible. My silver necklace, the one my mother had passed down to me, rested at my collarbone. I didn't dress to impress anyone, but I wanted to feel strong. Whole. For most of the dinner, I stayed quiet. Let them talk about their jobs, their vacations, their endless plans for things they never quite followed through on. I laughed politely when expected, passed the breadbasket when it reached me, kept my thoughts tucked neatly behind my smile. And then she did it. It was between dessert and coffee when she leaned back in her chair, swirling the last of her wine. Her eyes locked on me like a predator sizing up prey. The corner of her lips curled into that smirk, the kind you never forget once it's been aimed at you. Well, she said, her voice cutting through the chatter like glass. We've been talking, and I think it's only fair. Starting next month, we're raising your rent. The table fell silent. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard correctly. She let the pause hang there before continuing, $7,000. After all, this is New York. Nothing comes cheap here. And just like that, the silence shattered into laughter. Not polite chuckles, not nervous giggles. Full-bodied, roaring laughter. Her friends slapped the table, nearly choking on their wine. My son's cousin leaned back in his chair, wheezing from the absurdity of it. Even my son, my own flesh and blood, let out a weak smile, as though he found it mildly amusing but didn't dare laugh too loudly in case it crossed some invisible line. All eyes turned to me, waiting for the punchline to land, waiting for me to sputter, to blush, to protest that I couldn't possibly afford it. But I sat there, still, calm, because while they laughed at me, I knew something none of them did. The deed to the building was in my name. It had been in my name for over 20 years. The mortgage had been paid off before my son even graduated college. They were tenants in my house. Every wall, every floorboard, every inch of that brownstone belonged to me. But I didn't say it. Not yet. I looked at my son, waiting, hoping that he would say something. Anything. That's not funny. Or, come on, don't be cruel. Or at the very least, a simple, Mom, don't mind her. But he didn't. He stared at his plate, fiddling with his fork, pretending not to notice the humiliation unfolding right in front of him. His silence screamed louder than any word she had spoken. That silence, it gutted me. I felt a sting rise in my chest, the kind that makes your throat tighten and your eyes burn. But I swallowed it down. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I folded my napkin neatly on the table, took a slow sip of water, and smiled. A smile so calm it must have unnerved at least one of them, though they'd never admit it. 7,000, is it? I said quietly, more to myself than to anyone else. Well, we'll see. And then I excused myself from the table. I walked slowly up the stairs to my room, their laughter still echoing behind me. Each step felt like a drumbeat, steady and deliberate. I refused to rush, refused to let them think they had chased me away in shame. No, this wasn't retreat. This was regrouping. Once inside my room, I closed the door and stood by the window, staring out at the Brooklyn skyline. The city lights twinkled in the distance, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. I could still hear their voices drifting upward. More laughter, more jokes at my expense. My son's voice, so familiar, so beloved, mingling with hers, not to defend me, but to keep the peace with his wife. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. I had tolerated the digs, the whispers, the constant suggestions that I was overstaying my welcome. I had swallowed my pride for the sake of family, for the sake of keeping harmony. But this public humiliation, this deliberate attempt to paint me as weak, as powerless, as nothing more than an old woman who couldn't keep up, that was the last straw. I stood there for what felt like hours, the sounds of laughter eventually fading as the party wound down. By the time the house grew quiet, I knew one thing for certain. I would not let this slide. For years, I had let them believe they were in control, that they held the power. But the truth was, every brick of that house, every nail in the floorboards, every creak in the stairs, they were mine. And I was done letting them forget it. That night, as I laid in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed her smirk in my mind, that smug little curl of her lips, the way her eyes danced with amusement at my expense. Over and over, it burned itself into my memory until it wasn't pain I felt anymore. It was fuel. Because revenge doesn't always come in loud explosions or angry outbursts. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is the kind that brews slowly, silently, beneath the surface. The kind that no one sees coming until it's too late. And that night I made a vow. If they thought I was powerless, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. If you were sitting at that table with everyone laughing at you and the person you loved most staying silent, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed calm like I did? I'd love to know in the comments, because sometimes the way we react in those moments says more about us than anything else. But one thing's for certain, that dinner was the night I stopped being their silent punchline. And the first move of my revenge? Well, that came sooner than they expected. That night after the dinner party, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my body still but my mind restless. The house had finally quieted, yet inside me, the echoes of laughter continued like a cruel symphony. I thought about the way her lips curled into that smirk, the way the others roared at her words, and most of all, the way my son had sat there in silence, eyes glued to his plate as though the roast chicken crumbs on it were more deserving of his attention than the humiliation of his own mother. The silence cut deeper than any insult could, yet instead of breaking me, it sparked something I had not felt in years, a calm resolve. Not the fragile calm that trembles before shattering, but a grounded calm that sits heavy in your chest, carrying the weight of intention. I had walked away from that table with my dignity intact, and that choice was deliberate. I did not shout. I did not protest. I did not break down or beg for kindness. I left quietly, but my silence was not surrender. It was the first step in reclaiming what had always been mine, my self-respect, my authority, and the foundation they had taken for granted. I understood in that moment that my power did not come from speaking louder than them. My power lay in the things they did not know, the truths hidden behind my calm smile. And as I lay there, watching the light from the street lamp stripe across my ceiling, I knew my reaction would define everything that followed. The morning arrived with a crispness in the air. The sounds of Brooklyn stirring awake seeped through the window. Distant traffic, a vendor yelling down the block, children already playing on the sidewalk. I rose with an ease that surprised me, brewed coffee in the old machine I kept in my room, and sipped slowly as I looked out across the street. The building opposite, with its weathered brick and iron fire escape, mirrored mine. Sturdy, unyielding, standing tall after decades of storms. In it, I saw myself, worn by life but not defeated, stronger than they imagined. When I finally walked downstairs, the house smelled faintly of toast and the cloying sweetness of her perfume. My daughter-in-law was seated at the kitchen table, scrolling on her phone, nails tapping rhythmically against the screen. She looked up when I entered, and for a brief moment, I saw hesitation flicker across her face before she smoothed it over with practiced indifference. "Morning," she said, her tone casual, as if she had not publicly mocked me the night before. "Morning. I replied, my voice steady, pleasant even. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the clink of the spoon against the mug louder than it needed to be. I met her gaze directly as I stirred, and something in my composure unsettled her. She shifted in her chair, looked back at her phone, but I saw the way her fingers fumbled on the screen. That was my first silent victory. Not a word exchanged about the dinner, not a single acknowledgement of her cruelty, yet the balance had already begun to tilt. My calmness unnerved her. My restraint was louder than anger could ever be. Later that day, my son appeared at the doorway of the living room where I sat pretending to read. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. Hey, Mom. About last night, he trailed off, scratching the back of his neck like he had when he was a little boy caught sneaking cookies. She was just joking. You know how she is. Don't take it too seriously. I looked up from my book, met his eyes, and smiled faintly. Of course, I said. A joke. I'll keep that in mind. Relief washed over his face, but he did not realize my words were not forgiveness. They were a promise to myself. I would keep it in mind, and I would remember that when the time came, it would not be me begging for peace. His attempt to brush off her cruelty as humor was cowardice disguised as diplomacy, and in that moment, I accepted a painful truth. If I wanted justice, I could not rely on him. My son had chosen the easier path, and it was not me. That evening, after they settled into the living room with their wine glasses and idle chatter, I retreated to my study, a room they rarely entered, a room most forgot existed. To them, it was just where I kept books and paid bills. To me, it was a sanctuary. Behind the filing cabinet lay decades of history, my history. Folders marked neatly, papers stacked in orderly rows, records of everything I had worked for. Among them, the most important document of all, the deed to the brownstone. I pulled the folder out, laid it open on the desk, and there it was, my name, inked clearly, the legal proof of ownership. The house they strutted around in, the home she treated as her kingdom, the place they thought gave them power over me, it was mine. Every creak in the stairs, every beam overhead, every brick in the wall bore the weight of my sacrifice. They could laugh about raising my rent, but in truth, they were tenants in my house. And sooner or later, they would be reminded of it. I traced my fingers over my name, the weight of the paper grounding me. I thought about how easy it would be to march into the living room right then, slam the deed on the table, and silence them with the truth. But that would have been short-lived satisfaction. I did not want an outburst. I wanted something lasting, something calculated. I wanted them to feel the slow shift of power slipping through their fingers until they realized too late that it had never truly belonged to them. So I chose silence, not submission, but strategy. I placed the deed back into the folder, locked the cabinet, and walked out of the study with the same serene expression I had worn all day. They looked up briefly when I passed through the living room, then returned to their conversations, unaware that their world was about to change. The next week, I carried on as though nothing had happened. I cooked, I cleaned, I contributed my share. I laughed politely when spoken to, and I remained in the background when I wasn't needed. On the surface, I played the role they expected, the harmless mother-in-law quietly existing under their roof. But every movement was deliberate. Every smile was calculated. I wanted them to grow comfortable again, to believe I had accepted my place, to lower their guard until they couldn't imagine the storm waiting just beneath the surface. I began to notice their unease. My daughter-in-law watched me more carefully now, her eyes narrowing when she caught me smiling to myself in the kitchen, or humming softly as I folded laundry. My son seemed restless around me, as though he sensed there was something different but couldn't identify what. They didn't know it, but they were already losing. Because power doesn't always shift in loud declarations or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it shifts quietly, invisibly, until the ground beneath you feels unsteady and you don't even know why. My calmness, my silence was the first tremor. That week after the dinner party became the true turning point. It was not the smirk that changed everything, nor the laughter, nor even my son's silence. It was my choice to stay composed, to transform humiliation into fuel, to turn silence into strategy. By refusing to react in the way they expected, I had already taken back control. And as I stood in my study one last time that week, the folder locked safely away, I whispered to myself, this house is mine. And soon, they'll remember that. The calm before the storm had ended. Now it was time for the storm itself. The days following that dinner felt different, though outwardly nothing seemed to change. The city still bustled outside the windows of the brownstone. Horns honked in the distance. Delivery trucks rattled down the street, and children squealed as they chased one another up and down the block. But inside me, a shift had taken place. I no longer carried myself with the weariness of someone enduring humiliation. Instead, I walked with quiet purpose, every step fueled by a decision I hadn't voiced out loud but felt deeply in my bones. I would no longer be their victim. Each morning I woke early, not because I had to, but because my mind refused rest. I brewed coffee in the solitude of my room, sipped it slowly, and stared at the skyline. Brooklyn had always been home, its grit and stubbornness woven into my own character. The city taught me resilience. It taught me to endure cold winters, crowded subways, long hours, and longer nights. And it taught me something else. Survival belongs to those who adapt. I had adapted my whole life. Now I would adapt again, but not as a survivor this time, as someone who fought back. Reflection, I realized, wasn't just about replaying what happened at that dinner. It was about connecting it to every other moment I had swallowed my pride. The countless times she mocked me with those sly remarks. The whispers about how I was overstaying my welcome. The passive-aggressive reminders about groceries or bills. Each memory surfaced like a bruise that had never healed properly. I thought about the way she took ownership of my cooking, serving dishes as though she had put the hours into them. I thought about the way she told her friends stories that painted me as forgetful or outdated, always laughing at the expense of my age. And worst of all, I thought about my son, silent through it all, unwilling to defend me, unwilling even to acknowledge what he must have known was wrong. In my study, surrounded by the papers and records of my life's work, I allowed myself to relive these moments. Each one was a needle prick, but together they formed a tapestry of betrayal. Betrayal doesn't arrive in grand gestures. It builds quietly, in small silences and overlooked cruelties, until one day it stands before you fully formed, undeniable. That night at the dinner had simply revealed the betrayal already festering beneath the surface. But as painful as those reflections were, they also hardened my resolve. Pain, I realized, could be transformed. It could become a weapon if handled with patience. I began writing things down in a leather-bound notebook I kept hidden in my nightstand. Not just events, but plans. Questions I needed to answer. What did I want from all this? Did I want to embarrass her publicly the way she had embarrassed me? Did I want my son to regret his silence? Did I want to reclaim the house in a way that left no room for them to twist the narrative? Revenge without clarity can turn into chaos, and I refused to be chaotic. I wanted to be methodical. At first, my ideas were small. Withholding the little kindnesses I had once offered without thought. No more stepping in to cook when she was too busy. No more cleaning up after their late-night gatherings. No more quiet contributions that made the house run smoother. If they believed I was a burden, then I would stop carrying burdens for them. But the more I wrote, the clearer my vision became. This wasn't about petty inconveniences. This was about restoring balance, reminding them who I was and what I had built long before she came into the picture. Late one evening, I pulled out a stack of old photographs from my closet. Pictures of the brownstone when I first bought it. Walls chipped, roof leaking, floors scratched bare. Pictures of me standing with contractors, hard hat perched awkwardly on my head, overseeing repairs I had paid for in full. Pictures of my son as a little boy, his toys scattered on the same hardwood floors they now walked on, oblivious to the sacrifices that had made it possible. I laid the photographs out on my bed, studying them like pieces of a puzzle. This house was more than shelter. It was my story, my legacy, my proof that independence wasn't just a claim, it was my reality. And they had tried to erase that with one cruel joke. No, I thought. Not a joke. An attempt at dominance. An attempt to remind me of where they thought I stood. But the truth was, I had never stood beneath them. I had only allowed them to believe it. That realization became my turning point. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, filled with restless energy. I cooked breakfast, but this time only for myself. I set the table neatly with one plate, one cup of coffee, and one piece of toast with jam. When they wandered in later, bleary-eyed and hung over from whatever late night gathering they had indulged in, I was already finished. My daughter-in-law glanced at the clean dishes drying by the sink, then at me. "You didn't make coffee?" she asked, her tone laced with mild irritation. I looked up, smiled politely, and replied, "Oh, I thought you preferred your oat milk lattes from that cafe on the corner." Then I returned to my newspaper. It was subtle, almost invisible to an outsider, but I saw the flicker in her eyes. She was so used to me cushioning her life with my quiet contributions that the absence of them unsettled her. My son poured himself cereal without comment, but I noticed the way his jaw tightened. Small cracks, small shifts. In the days that followed, I withdrew further. I stopped grocery shopping for the household. I stopped folding their laundry when it was left in the dryer. I stopped answering the door for their deliveries. Each omission was deliberate, a reminder that the things they took for granted didn't happen by magic. Someone had been holding the threads together, and that someone was me. But my withdrawal was only the beginning. True revenge, I knew, couldn't be built on silence alone. It required action. It required strategy. And it required patience. At night, when the house was quiet, I opened my notebook again and began sketching out steps. Step 1. Reclaim financial control. They believed they held the power because they imagined I depended on them. But the truth was, the entire structure of their lives depended on me. Step 2. Expose her for what she truly was. Not through shouting matches or confrontations she could twist, but through undeniable actions and facts. Step 3. Remind my son, whether he liked it or not, of who I really was. Not the woman they mocked at the dinner table, but the mother who had built the very foundation under his feet. The plan was still forming, but the clarity was there. I felt lighter than I had in years, as though shedding the burden of silence had given me back my breath. I will admit something here. Sitting in my study with the deeds spread out in front of me, I felt a sense of power I hadn't felt in a long time. For years, I had tried to be humble about what I had accomplished, never wanting to appear arrogant, never wanting to make others uncomfortable. But humility had turned into invisibility. They had mistaken my quiet strength for weakness. That would be their downfall. By the end of that week, I was resolved. I would no longer act as though their comfort was my responsibility. I would no longer accept their dismissive remarks as harmless jokes. I would no longer let their silence define me. My son may have chosen the easier path, but I would not. I had walked hard roads before. I knew how to endure storms. Revenge is not fire. Fire is bright, uncontrollable, ravenous. Fire consumes everything in its path, and when it is done, all that remains is ash. No, my revenge could not be fire. It had to be something slower, steadier. It had to smolder, invisible at first, creeping through the walls until one day they woke up and realized the foundation beneath them had already been eaten away. My daughter-in-law loved spectacles. She thrived on attention, on laughter at someone else's expense, on grand gestures that made her look clever. I would not give her that satisfaction. My revenge would be patient. My revenge would be quiet. My revenge would be a slow burn. The first thing I did was stop funding the little conveniences they had come to take for granted. For years, I had slipped cash into envelopes at Christmas, birthdays, anniversaries. Always generous, always thoughtful. I had covered utility bills when my son's hours were cut. I had paid for repairs when the washing machine broke, when the car needed servicing, when they forgot to renew the insurance. I had done these things silently, never asking for thanks, never demanding recognition, because that's what mothers do. But now I began to withdraw. When the electric bill came, I let it sit on the counter. When the faucet in the upstairs bathroom dripped, I didn't call the plumber. When my daughter-in-law sighed about how much groceries had gone up again, I nodded sympathetically and went back to reading my paper. At first, the changes were too small to notice. They assumed I was distracted, or tired, or maybe even a little forgetful. But soon the cracks began to show. One evening, I overheard them whispering in the kitchen. "She didn't cover the cone bill this month," she hissed. "Do you think she's doing it on purpose?" My son mumbled something about me being older, maybe slipping a little. I smiled to myself in the next room. Let them think what they wanted. Their underestimation of me was my greatest weapon. The second phase was more deliberate. I began to reclaim my space in the brownstone, not by announcing it, but by acting as though it were natural. Because it was natural. This was my house, after all. I stopped asking permission to rearrange the living room furniture. I stopped pretending I was a guest in the kitchen. One Saturday morning, while they slept late after a night out in Manhattan, I cleared out the clutter they had piled in the dining room. Boxes of clothes she ordered online and never wore. Gadgets he swore he needed but never used, and set everything neatly in bags by the door. When they came downstairs and saw the room immaculate, she sputtered, "Where's my stuff?" "In the bags," I said evenly, sipping my coffee. "If you want it, you can put it in your room. The dining room isn't storage space." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. My son rubbed his forehead, clearly unwilling to confront me directly. They dragged the bags upstairs, muttering under their breath, but neither of them challenged me. It was the smallest of victories, but victories have a way of building momentum. I also began to subtly disrupt their routines, not with malice, but with precision. I stopped informing them when repairmen were scheduled, letting the doorbell ring until she scrambled to answer it in her robe. I moved my cleaning supplies into a locked cabinet, forcing her to buy her own when the floors got sticky. When guests came over, I no longer played hostess. I sat politely, contributing little, watching as she scrambled to fill the silence I once carried so gracefully. Without realizing it, they were beginning to feel the absence of the role I had played all along. The role of the stabilizer, the caretaker, the silent support system. But my slow burn was not limited to the house. I had other strings to pull, strings they didn't even know I held. My son worked in finance, but it had been my connections, friends I'd known from my years working at the bank, people I'd met through neighborhood associations, that had helped him land his first internship. Over the years, I had quietly kept those relationships alive, exchanging holiday cards, attending retirement parties, checking in over coffee in Midtown. They respected me. They remembered me. And I knew that if the time came, I could make a few calls that would remind him his success had not been built on his own brilliance alone. Meanwhile, I started documenting things, not in a paranoid way, but with the same meticulousness I had used when managing accounts at the bank. I wrote down dates, comments she made, times they failed to contribute to household expenses. I saved receipts, utility bills, maintenance invoices. I photographed damage they caused and never fixed. Every detail went into a folder labeled simply, household records. They didn't know it, but I was building a case. Not for court necessarily, but for the court of reputation, the court of truth. The real shift came one evening when she invited friends over for dinner. Normally, I would have stepped in, helping to prepare dishes, setting the table, making sure everything looked presentable. But that night, I did nothing. I sat in my study while laughter drifted up the stairs. Halfway through the evening, I heard her sharp voice, "The oven isn't heating right. Why didn't anyone tell me?" My son muttered something. Then footsteps stormed up the stairs. She appeared in my doorway, face flushed, eyes narrowed. "The oven isn't working," she snapped. I looked up from my notebook calmly. "Yes, I noticed that last week." "Why didn't you get it fixed?" she demanded. I closed the notebook slowly, met her gaze, and replied, "Because it's not my responsibility to fix everything anymore." She stared at me, stunned, as though she couldn't quite comprehend what I had said. I turned back to my writing, dismissing her without another word. She stomped away, and I heard her hiss to my son downstairs. The evening ended awkwardly, their friends leaving earlier than expected. Another small victory, another piece of the slow burn. The beauty of patience is that it disarms your enemies. She wanted me to lash out, to argue, to make a scene she could twist into evidence of me being difficult or unstable. By remaining calm, by withdrawing my silent labor, I made her unravel on her own. I didn't have to point out her shortcomings. Others began to notice them naturally. One afternoon, as I walked to the corner store, a neighbor stopped me. "Everything okay over there?" she asked kindly. "I heard some shouting the other night." I smiled faintly. "Everything's fine," I said. But inside, I was smiling wider. Neighbors notice things, and reputations in Brooklyn are fragile. Still, I knew these were only the early steps. The real blows had yet to come. My reflection had given me clarity, and my resolve had given me direction. Now the slow burn was in motion, and with each passing day, they were losing ground they didn't even realize they stood on. Because revenge doesn't arrive in a single dramatic act. It builds, piece by piece, until one day the ones who thought they were untouchable realize the fire has already surrounded them. And as I sat in my study one night looking at the deed once again, I whispered to myself, "You thought you could raise my rent. You thought you could mock me. But soon, you'll remember who this house truly belongs to." The storm was gathering, and they wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. The cracks in their perfect facade began as hairline fractures, almost invisible to anyone not looking closely. But I was looking. I had been watching carefully, noting every small shift in their confidence, every slip in their control, every glance that revealed their growing unease. My slow burn was working, and soon the consequences of their arrogance would no longer stay confined within the walls of my brownstone. They would spill outward into the world they so desperately wanted to impress. The first sign came on a Friday evening. They had invited a group of colleagues from my son's office to dinner, a mix of eager junior associates and a senior partner whose approval my son had been chasing for months. Normally, I would have stepped in behind the scenes, making sure everything ran smoothly. This time, I sat back. I watched as my daughter-in-law scrambled in the kitchen, fumbling with recipes she didn't fully understand. I watched as my son tried to charm his boss with forced laughter, beads of sweat forming at his temple. Halfway through the evening, disaster struck. The chicken, undercooked and pale, was carried to the table with a triumphant flourish. But the senior partner's wife, a sharp-eyed woman with years of polite dinner parties under her belt, poked her fork into it and frowned. "It's raw," she said simply. The table fell silent. My daughter-in-law flushed crimson, stammering something about the oven being unreliable. My son jumped in, trying to smooth it over with jokes, but the damage was done. The guests excused themselves early, claiming an early morning ahead. I could see the embarrassment burning in my son's face as he closed the door behind them. Later that night, I heard the argument. Her voice sharp, accusing. "This is your mother's fault. She probably messed with the oven on purpose." His voice weary. "You can't blame her for everything." I lay in my bed, silent, a small smile tugging at my lips. I hadn't needed to sabotage anything. They had unraveled all on their own. Word of their disastrous dinner spread quickly. Brooklyn is a big place, but reputations travel fast in professional circles. My son grew quieter in the weeks that followed, more distracted, his confidence shaken. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, grew sharper, her tone with me colder, her jabs more obvious. But the more openly she tried to paint me as the problem, the more others began to see through her. I helped that along, of course, not through lies, but through carefully chosen truths. When neighbors stopped me on the street and asked how things were, I would sigh softly and say, "Oh, you know how young couples are. They've been under a lot of pressure lately." I try to stay out of the way. I never badmouthed her directly, never accused her outright. I didn't need to. People notice things on their own when you give them just enough to look closer. Then came the bills. Without my quiet contributions, they began to fall behind. Late notices arrived in the mail, and I made no effort to hide them. I left them on the counter where visitors could see. One afternoon, a family friend stopped by unexpectedly. As she sat in the kitchen sipping coffee with me, she glanced at the stack of envelopes, her brow furrowing at the bold red letters, "Past due." She said nothing then, but later I overheard her on the phone with someone else, her voice carrying easily through the thin walls. "It seems like they're struggling over there. I don't know what's going on." I didn't correct her. I didn't explain that the house was mine, that the bills were theirs to manage, that they had chosen to bite the hand that had once fed them. I simply let the narrative take shape on its own. Exposure doesn't always come from dramatic revelations. Sometimes it comes from letting people see what's been there all along. The real turning point came with the neighborhood association. Once a month, residents gathered to discuss community issues, garbage collection, street repairs, parking disputes. I had attended faithfully for years, long before my son and his wife moved in. My daughter-in-law, eager to be seen as a rising star in the neighborhood, had recently begun attending as well. She loved the spotlight, loved to hear herself speak, loved to present ideas as though they had sprung from her brilliance alone. But that month, the topic of property taxes came up, and she spoke with confidence about our house, our investments, our financial responsibilities. I sat quietly in the back, waiting until she had finished her little speech. Then, when the chairperson asked for clarification on a particular point, I raised my hand. My voice was calm, steady, but it carried across the room. Actually, I said, the house on the corner is in my name. I've owned it for decades. Any changes to tax records should reflect that. The room fell silent. My daughter-in-law's smile froze on her face, her eyes darting toward me with barely contained fury. The chairperson nodded, jotting down a note. "Thank you for clarifying, Mrs." And just like that, the truth was out, not in anger, not in confrontation, but in simple, undeniable fact. The murmurs started almost immediately. By the end of the meeting, half the room knew the brownstone was mine, not theirs. The fallout at home was immediate. She stormed into the house ahead of me, her heels striking the floor like gunshots. "Why would you humiliate me like that?" she demanded, her face twisted with rage. I set down my coat calmly, met her glare, and said, "I didn't humiliate you. I told the truth. If the truth embarrasses you, that's not my problem." My son tried to mediate, his voice weary, but I could see in his eyes that something had shifted. The silence he had once used as a shield was cracking. He couldn't ignore the reality any longer. From that moment on, their grip on the narrative began to loosen. Friends who once laughed at her jokes now exchanged uncertain glances. Colleagues who once admired their lifestyle began to question it. Neighbors who once believed her polished stories now asked me for clarification. The truth was slipping through, and no matter how she tried to spin it, she couldn't control it. The exposure wasn't dramatic, but it was relentless. A steady drip of truth, seeping into the cracks of their carefully constructed image. And as their world grew smaller, mine expanded. People began to greet me differently at the store, with respect instead of pity. Old friends called to say they had heard about the house, congratulating me on my foresight and independence. My reputation, once quietly dismissed, was being rebuilt brick by brick, stronger than ever. The fallout was exactly what I had planned, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. And as I sat in my study one evening, listening to their muffled argument upstairs, I knew the tables had turned. The power they thought they held was gone, slipping through their fingers like sand. They had wanted to expose me as weak, dependent, irrelevant. Instead, they had exposed themselves. And the best part? I hadn't even started with the real revenge yet. The silence in the brownstone had changed. It was no longer the heavy silence of my son refusing to defend me, or the dismissive silence of my daughter-in-law pretending I didn't exist. Now it was the strained silence of people tiptoeing through their own home, afraid of what might slip through the cracks. Conversations that once rang out in the living room became hushed whispers behind closed doors. Their laughter, once so loud and pointed at my expense, grew brittle, like glass about to shatter. I moved through the house as though I owned the air itself, because I did. After the neighborhood association meeting, after the truth of my ownership spread like quiet wildfire, the change in my daughter-in-law was immediate and dramatic. She was still sharp, still biting, but there was a desperation now. Her barbs lacked their old confidence. When she said, "Don't forget to pay your share," her eyes darted nervously to see if I would correct her again in front of witnesses. When she made sly jokes about me being old-fashioned, her voice carried a quiver she couldn't disguise. She was losing control of the narrative, and she knew it. My son, on the other hand, grew quieter still, but his silence was no longer apathy. It was the silence of a man trapped between two worlds, unsure which one would crumble first. He had built his loyalty to his wife on sand, and now that sand was sliding out from under him. I could see it in his eyes when he looked at me. Shame mingled with something else, something like regret. The confrontation came on a Tuesday evening, unexpected and sharp as broken glass. I had just returned from a walk around Prospect Park, the autumn air crisp against my skin, when I found my daughter-in-law waiting in the living room. She stood rigid, arms crossed, her face tight with anger she had been holding in for far too long. "We need to talk," she said flatly. I hung up my coat, set down my bag, and sat calmly in the armchair across from her. "Then talk." Her words spilled out in a rush. "You've been undermining me. You've been making me look stupid in front of the neighbors, in front of his colleagues, in front of everyone. You think you're so clever, sitting there with your little smirk, acting like you're above it all. But you're not. You're just—" She stopped, her voice trembling, searching for the word that would wound me most. "You're just old, and you can't stand that the world doesn't revolve around you anymore." I let her words hang in the air, their venom dissipating in the silence. Then I leaned forward, my voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through her fury. "No, dear. I'm not undermining you. I'm revealing you. There's a difference. The world doesn't revolve around me. That's true. But this house does. And the truth is, you tried to push me aside in my own home. You mocked me, you disrespected me, and you thought I would stay silent. But I've stayed silent long enough." Her face twisted, anger and fear warring inside her. "You can't just throw me out," she spat. I leaned back, folded my hands neatly in my lap, and smiled. "I don't need to throw you out. You're already unraveling on your own. All I have to do is wait." It was at that moment my son entered, his expression tight, his tie loosened from another long day at the office. He looked between us, the tension in the room so thick it nearly suffocated him. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice weary. "She's trying to turn everyone against me," his wife snapped, gesturing wildly at me. "She's been playing games, making me look bad." I stood slowly, meeting my son's eyes with a calm he couldn't ignore. "I haven't been playing games," I said. "I've been telling the truth. And maybe it's time you stop pretending you don't see it." For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. His wife looked at him, desperate for support, but he didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he looked at me. And in that look, I saw the boy he used to be. The boy who had once trusted me to fix scraped knees, to chase away nightmares, to believe in him when no one else did. The boy who had once known I was his anchor. But that boy was buried under years of choices, years of silence, years of loyalty misplaced. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, torn between the life he had built and the truth standing in front of him. The confrontation ended not with shouting, but with that silence. My daughter-in-law stormed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. My son lingered, shifting uncomfortably, before muttering, "I don't know what you're trying to do, Mom." I placed a hand on his shoulder, gentle but firm. "I'm reminding you of who I am, and who I've always been." He didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. That small hesitation was enough. In the days that followed, the fallout from that confrontation rippled through the house. My daughter-in-law avoided me, retreating to her room with her phone pressed to her ear, whispering to friends about how unbearable I had become. But whispers only travel so far when the truth is already out. My son, meanwhile, grew distant from her, their arguments louder now, their laughter rarer. The silence between them was no longer a shield. It was a wall. And then came the letter. One afternoon, slipped under my door in careful handwriting, and signed but unmistakable. "I'm sorry," it read. "I should have defended you that night. I should have defended you every time. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. Please don't give up on me." I sat in my chair, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. My son's words, finally written down after months of silence. It wasn't redemption, not yet. But it was something. A crack in the wall he had built around himself. A crack I could use. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized the confrontation hadn't just been about her. It had been about him too. About forcing him to face the truth he had been avoiding, about reminding him that silence carries its own kind of betrayal. Closure didn't mean forgiveness. It didn't mean everything was healed. It meant I had taken back control of the narrative, forced them both to confront the reality they had tried to bury. I didn't know yet whether there would be redemption for him, whether he could rebuild what he had broken. But I knew one thing with certainty. The days of me sitting silently at that dinner table, swallowing humiliation, were over. The confrontation had happened. The truth was out. And the slow burn of my revenge was far from finished. The letter stayed on my nightstand for days. Its edges curled slightly from being read and reread. The ink smudged in one corner where my thumb had lingered too long. It wasn't long, it wasn't elaborate, but it was honest. And that honesty, after so many months of silence, carried more weight than any grand gesture could. I'm sorry. Please don't give up on me. I traced the words with my finger late at night, the sound of the city drifting in through the cracked window. Brooklyn had a way of holding onto its noise even in the darkest hours. Distant sirens, muffled conversations on the sidewalk, the hum of traffic that never quite faded. But inside my room, there was a strange kind of peace. For the first time since that dinner where my daughter-in-law had humiliated me, I felt a flicker of hope. Not because everything was fixed, but because he had admitted, if only in writing, that he had failed me. The days after the letter were strange. My son didn't bring it up directly, and neither did I. But I could see small changes in him. He lingered longer in the kitchen when I made tea in the mornings, asking if I wanted him to pick up anything from the store. He sat beside me on the couch one evening, watching an old movie without saying much, just being there. They were small gestures, quiet and almost clumsy, but they spoke louder than silence ever had. My daughter-in-law noticed too. I saw the way her eyes narrowed when she walked into the room and found him sitting with me. She masked it quickly, putting on that brittle smile, but I knew her well enough to see the cracks. She thrived on control, over him, over the narrative, over me. And now she was losing it. One Sunday afternoon, he invited me to walk with him through Prospect Park. It was something we hadn't done since he was a teenager, when we'd spend hours wandering the paths, eating ice cream from the carts, talking about everything and nothing. The air was crisp, the leaves painting the park in shades of orange and red, and for a moment it felt like stepping back in time. He didn't say much at first, just walked beside me, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Finally, as we sat on a bench overlooking the lake, he sighed heavily. I don't know how we got here, he said quietly. I don't know when things got so ugly. I looked at him, my heart aching at the lines of worry etched into his face. You got here because you stopped seeing me as your mother and started seeing me as an inconvenience. Because you let her words become your silence. He winced but didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, staring at the water. I thought I was protecting her. I thought staying quiet would keep the peace. But I see now it just made everything worse. I let the silence stretch between us, not heavy this time, but thoughtful. Then I reached over and placed my hand over his. I don't need perfection from you. I don't even need constant defense. I just need to know that when it matters, you'll stand up for me. That I'm not alone at that table. His grip tightened slightly, a quiet promise. And though the words didn't come, I could feel them in that simple gesture. Back at the house, the shift grew more visible. He started eating dinner at the table with me instead of waiting until late when it was just him and his wife. He asked about my day, listened when I answered. Once he even defended me when she made a snide remark about me still using a checkbook, like it's the Stone Age. He glanced at her sharply and said, You know, not everything old is useless. Some things last because they work. The look on her face was priceless, shock, disbelief. Then a flash of fury she tried to disguise with a tight smile. For the first time, he had pushed back. But redemption isn't a straight path. It's messy, uneven, filled with steps forward and backward. A few nights later, I overheard them arguing upstairs. Her voice was shrill, accusing, She's manipulating you. Can't you see that? His voice was lower, steadier than I expected. She's my mother. Maybe I should have been listening to her all along. That night, he came down to the kitchen after she had slammed their bedroom door and sat with me in silence. He didn't say what they had fought about. He didn't need to. The storm upstairs told me everything. Redemption wasn't about him suddenly becoming the perfect son. It was about those small choices, sitting beside me, defending me, admitting his mistakes. It was about rebuilding trust brick by brick, even while the house still shook from her fury. I wasn't naive. I knew she wouldn't let go easily. She had built her identity on being the one in control, on twisting narratives to suit her image. My son pulling away from her, even slightly, would feel like betrayal. And in her mind, betrayal demanded punishment. I could feel it building in her, the quiet plotting, the desperate attempts to claw back the power she was losing. But the difference now was that I wasn't standing alone. One evening, as we cleared the table after dinner, he paused, looking at me with a seriousness that caught me off guard. I know I can't undo the things I didn't say before, but I want to do better. I want you to feel like you belong here, not like you're some guest we're putting up with. I studied him carefully, weighing his words. Belonging isn't something you say, I replied softly. It's something you show, and you're starting to show it. For the first time in a long while, I saw relief in his expression, like a man who had been carrying a weight for years and was finally starting to set it down. The road ahead was uncertain. I knew that. She wasn't going to simply fade into the background, and their marriage wasn't going to dissolve overnight. But something fundamental had shifted. My son had remembered who I was, not just his mother, but a woman who had built her own life, her own strength, her own legacy. And once he remembered that, she could no longer erase me with her smirks and her barbed comments. That was the beginning of his redemption. Not in dramatic speeches or grand gestures, but in the quiet moments where he chose me again, even if it cost him. And as I lay in bed that night, the letter still on my nightstand, I realized that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about owning it, learning from it, and choosing differently the next time. He was choosing differently. Finally. And that meant the balance of power in the house had shifted for good. The brownstone was quiet in a way it hadn't been for months. Not the suffocating silence of unspoken tension, not the brittle silence of swallowed laughter, but a softer, steadier quiet. The kind that comes when storms pass and the air feels cleaner, even if the ground is still wet with the evidence of rain. I walked through the rooms one evening, running my hand over the banister I'd polished myself years ago. The wood worn smooth by decades of life lived inside these walls. This house had seen arguments and reconciliations, triumphs and heartbreaks, but it had never once failed me. It had been my anchor when people tried to shake me, and now it had been the stage where the truth finally revealed itself. My son had changed in ways I never thought I'd see again. The small gestures that once seemed impossible had become regular. Asking if I wanted tea, setting the table without being asked, defending me in the smallest but most meaningful ways. It wasn't about the actions themselves. It was about the intention behind them. Each one was a quiet apology, each one a step toward making amends. Redemption isn't about erasing the damage. It's about showing you've learned from it. And slowly, brick by brick, he was building something new between us. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, was unraveling. She still put on her polished smiles in public, but I could see the panic in her eyes. She had lost her grip on the narrative, and no amount of forced charm could bring it back. At dinners, she was quieter now, her smirks replaced by tight lips pressed together as she stabbed at her food. She avoided me when she could, and when she couldn't, her words lacked their old sharpness. It was as though she knew every jab might backfire now, that every insult might only confirm what others were already starting to believe. The tables had turned, not because I had shouted louder, but because I had stood taller. And the beauty of it was that the revenge wasn't explosive. It was patient, precise, and permanent. One evening, as I sat in my study with the letter from my son tucked safely in the drawer, I thought about the journey, about the way humiliation had burned me alive at that dinner table, about the way silence had felt sharper than words, about the way laughter had cut deeper than any knife. And I thought about how I had chosen not to react with anger, but with strategy. Revenge hadn't been about destruction. It had been about reclamation. Reclaiming my dignity, my authority, my place in the family I had helped build. The resolution wasn't in her defeat, though watching her flounder carried its own satisfaction. The resolution was in my victory. Quiet, steady, undeniable. I took back what she tried to strip away from me. And I realized something else. My son's redemption was part of my resolution too. I hadn't done this just to prove a point to her. I had done it to remind him of who I was. And in doing so, I reminded him of who he was too. He was no longer the man who sat silently while I was mocked. He was becoming the man who stood with me, even if his voice shook while he did it. That, more than anything, gave me peace. The symbolic object of it all sat quietly in the corner of my study, the deed to the house, framed years ago as a reminder of my independence. For so long it had just been a document, a piece of paper with legal language and signatures. But now it meant more. It was a testament that I had built a life no one could take from me. Not her smirks, not his silence, not the laughter of a table full of people who thought they knew the truth. That deed was my shield and my sword, and it had carried me through the storm. Resolution doesn't mean every problem vanishes. My daughter-in-law was still in the house, still simmering with resentment, still plotting in her own quiet way. But the difference was, she no longer held the power to hurt me. Not really. Her words had lost their sting because my son had finally begun to see through them, and because I had proven, to myself most of all, that I didn't need his defense to survive. I had my own. Still, as I closed my eyes that night, I thought about the cost. About the hours I had spent carrying the weight of silence, about the energy it had taken to plan my quiet revenge, about the nights I lay awake replaying that dinner in my head. This resolution hadn't come cheap. It had been earned, paid for with patience and pain. And that's why I'll pause here to say this. These stories, these hours of putting pen to paper, of reliving pain to show you the arc of triumph, they take time. They take more of me than you might realize. So if you've made it this far, if you've walked this journey with me chapter by chapter, I'd be grateful if you supported it. A simple subscribe, a comment, even just a like, it might seem small, but it's the fuel that makes the hours of work worth it. Without it, voices like mine would stay silent. The resolution was mine, but sharing it with you, that's what makes it whole. Because in the end, revenge isn't about the antagonist, it's about the survivor. And I had survived. More than that, I had thrived. I had shown her that smirks fade, that words lose power, that silence can be broken. And I had shown myself that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers patiently until the walls crumble. As I sat at the dinner table one final evening, my son on one side, my daughter-in-law on the other, I felt the shift fully settle. She no longer smirked. He no longer stayed silent. The air was different, heavier, yes, but balanced. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Not as a burden, not as a guest, but as the woman who owned the house, the woman who had fought back without ever raising her voice. And that was enough. Resolution doesn't mean happily ever after. It means clarity. It means peace in knowing that no matter what happens next, I've reclaimed what's mine. My dignity, my strength, my silence turned into power. That night, before I went to bed, I touched the frame deed once more, my fingers brushing against the glass. We did it, I whispered. And in that moment, the house itself seemed to hum with quiet affirmation. The battle was over. The resolution was mine. Resolution is a strange thing. It doesn't always come with fanfare or grand declarations. More often, it arrives in quiet moments, in subtle shifts, in the way a house feels lighter when tension has been stripped away. For weeks after the confrontation and my son's first steps toward redemption, the brownstone settled into a new rhythm. My daughter-in-law walked carefully, as though every word might trip her, every glance might reveal her. My son was cautious too, still finding his footing, still learning what it meant to balance loyalty to me with the reality of his marriage. But through it all, the balance of power was no longer tilted against me. I had reclaimed my space, my dignity, my silence turned into strength. Still, there was one piece missing. The last word. Not in the literal sense. I had no need to scream or deliver some dramatic speech. The last word was about control, about ensuring that no matter what twists and turns the future held, the truth of who I was, what I owned, and what I had endured would stand unchallenged. It came in the form of a gathering. Thanksgiving was approaching, and as it had been for decades, the brownstone became the designated home for dinner. This time, however, I planned it differently. I reached out to family members myself, cousins from Queens, old friends from church in Brooklyn Heights, neighbors who had known me since before my son was born. I wanted the table filled not just with people, but with history, with voices that remembered who I was before she ever walked through my door. When the day came, the house smelled of roasted turkey and sweet potatoes, of cranberry sauce simmering with orange zest, of pumpkin pie cooling on the counter. The table was set with the china I had bought years ago, polished and gleaming under the soft glow of the chandelier. And when the guests began to arrive, the house filled with warmth, not the brittle laughter of performances past, but genuine conversation, familiar voices, the kind of connection I had always believed family dinners should bring. My daughter-in-law played her role, smiling, carrying platters, offering drinks. But I could see the stiffness in her movements, the tightness in her jaw. She knew this wasn't her stage anymore. This was mine. My son, meanwhile, seemed more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. He moved easily among the guests, pouring wine, laughing at jokes, slipping back into the rhythm of family he had nearly lost. Dinner began with a toast. In the past, my son or his wife would seize the moment, raising their glasses with carefully chosen words meant to highlight themselves. But this time, before they could move, I stood. I want to thank you all for being here, I began, my voice steady, carrying across the table. This house has seen many Thanksgivings, and tonight I'm grateful not just for the food on the table, but for the people around it. Family, old friends, neighbors, you've all been part of my journey. And this house, my home, wouldn't be the same without the memories we've made together. There was a pause, a ripple of acknowledgement as people raised their glasses. But the subtle emphasis wasn't lost on anyone. My home, my house, the truth, spoken plainly in front of witnesses who mattered. I caught the flicker of rage in my daughter-in-law's eyes, quickly masked with a smile as she clinked her glass. But it was too late. The last word wasn't a jab. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a reminder, a statement of fact. As the night went on, the difference was palpable. Guests asked me about the history of the house, reminiscing about old parties, asking if I remembered this event or that visitor. And I did. I remembered it all. My son sat beside me, adding his own memories, stories of childhood sleepovers, snowstorms that had buried the street, birthday parties that had filled the rooms with laughter. For the first time in years, it felt like a celebration rooted in truth instead of performance. My daughter-in-law sat quietly, smiling when required, passing dishes when asked. But her presence was diminished. She was no longer the center of the stage. She was a supporting character in a story she had tried to rewrite, but failed to control. After dessert, as the guests began to leave, several pulled me aside. "You've built something incredible here," one cousin said, gesturing toward the house. "It's clear this place is yours. You should be proud." "I am," I replied simply. And I was. When the last guest had gone, the house fell into a quieter kind of silence. My son helped me clear the dishes, stacking them carefully in the sink. My daughter-in-law disappeared upstairs, claiming she was tired, her footsteps heavy against the wood. As he dried the plates beside me, my son spoke softly. "You handled that beautifully." I glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Handled what?" "The toast. The way you," reminded everyone. It was clear, but it wasn't cruel. "It was just you." I smiled faintly, setting another plate on the towel. Sometimes the last word doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be true. He nodded, thoughtful, as though letting the weight of that sink in. For the first time, I felt like he truly understood. Not just the pain of his silence, but the strength of my patience, the strategy of my revenge, the dignity of my resolution. Later that night, as I sat alone in my study, I looked once more at the framed deed on the wall. The symbolic object of my independence, my shield and my sword. It wasn't just paper. It was proof. Proof that I had built something no one could take from me. Proof that when they laughed at me, when they mocked me, when they thought I was powerless, they were wrong. The last word wasn't about humiliating her. It wasn't about crushing him. It was about standing tall in the truth of who I was, and I had done it. The final pieces of the revenge had fallen into place, not with fireworks, but with quiet certainty. My daughter-in-law might rage, might scheme, might twist herself into knots trying to reclaim control. But the truth was out. My son had seen it. The family had seen it. The neighbors had seen it. And no amount of denial could erase it now. The last word was mine, and it always would be. It's strange how a story can begin with silence and end with it too, but in two very different forms. The silence that started all this was heavy, suffocating, and cruel. The silence of my son sitting at a dinner table, refusing to defend me while laughter filled the room at my expense. That silence cut deeper than any insult his wife could have thrown at me. But the silence that I sit in now, months later, is different. It's a silence filled with peace, clarity, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I didn't just endure, I triumphed. The journey here wasn't easy. It never is when family and betrayal intertwine. The woman my son married had tried to reduce me to a punchline, a burden, a relic in my own home. She believed her smirks and jabs carried more weight than decades of my independence, more authority than the deed I held in my name. For a time, she almost made me believe it too. Humiliation can do that. It can trick you into doubting your own strength. But strength, true strength, doesn't fade because someone else mocks it. It waits, patiently, and waiting became my greatest weapon. I didn't shout. I didn't storm. I didn't slam doors or throw ultimatums. I sat quietly, I observed, I planned. I let her believe she was winning, all while laying the groundwork for her unraveling. And when the time came, when the world began to see the truth piece by piece, I didn't gloat. I simply told the truth, calmly and plainly, until the weight of it crushed the illusion she had built. That was the beauty of it. My revenge wasn't about theatrics. It wasn't about explosions or public humiliation. It was about precision, about letting the truth do the work for me. And the truth is always heavier than lies. My son's journey was different. He had to face the cost of his silence, to confront the fact that by saying nothing, he had said everything. For so long, I wondered if he would ever come back to me, if the boy who once trusted me with his whole world had been lost forever to the man who sat quietly while I was mocked. But redemption is possible, even in the messiest of situations. Slowly, painfully, he began to remember who I was. He began to step forward, not with grand gestures, but with small, steady choices that showed he had learned. He slipped a letter under my door. He walked with me through Prospect Park, just like we used to. He sat beside me at dinner, defended me when she mocked my habits, admitted his mistakes even when his voice faltered. And through those actions, trust began to rebuild, not quickly, not completely, but enough. Enough to remind me that he was still my son. And her. My daughter-in-law still lives in this house. She still tries, in her way, to cling to the control she once held. But the difference is, her power has withered. Her barbs no longer land. Her smirks no longer sting. The people she wanted to impress now see through her. The neighbors know the truth. The family understands who really built this home. And my son, he no longer looks at her with blind loyalty. He looks at her with eyes that finally see. The final act of resolution came not in confrontation, but in celebration. That Thanksgiving dinner, surrounded by family and friends who knew the history of these walls, I took back the last word without shouting it. A toast, a simple acknowledgement that this was my home, that these were my memories, that this life was mine. And in that moment, with everyone listening, the truth settled permanently into place. I realized then that revenge isn't always about tearing someone down. Sometimes it's about lifting yourself back up to where you were always meant to be. It's about reclaiming the dignity someone tried to strip from you and standing taller than you ever have before. This house is still mine. My independence is still mine. My story is still mine. And no smirk, no silence, no laughter will ever take that away from me again. As I sit in my study now, the framed deed hanging on the wall beside me, I think about the symbolic weight it carries. It isn't just a piece of paper. It's proof. Proof that I built a life on my own terms. Proof that when people doubted me, I was strong enough to stand. Proof that even when my own son failed me, I didn't crumble. I endured. I planned. And in the end, I won. The silence in this house is peaceful now. Not because the conflicts have vanished, they never fully do, but because I know I can face whatever comes. I've reclaimed my voice, and I've reminded everyone, including myself, that I am not a burden. I am not irrelevant. I am not weak. I am the woman who owns the ground beneath their feet. And that is the kind of silence I can live with. So if you've walked this journey with me, if you felt the sting of silence, the humiliation of mockery, the triumph of quiet revenge, I'll ask you this one final time. If you were in my shoes, would you have done the same? Or would you have let the silence swallow you whole? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this aren't just mine, they're ours. They're reminders of what it means to survive, to reclaim, to win without ever shouting. And with that, my story comes full circle.